Do you know about the Haruma Fuji incident at the end of last year? Does anyone know? Is there no friend of sumo among you? No sumo friends? Okay, Haruma Fuji is a Mongolian sumo wrestler, one of the highest rank, a yokozuna, or he was a yokozuna until this incident in November last year. A group of Mongolian sumo wrestlers met in November last year, and they had a lot of food and a lot of alcohol, and then some kind of incident occurred. Haruma Fuji, who is of the highest rank, suddenly started to beat up one of the younger sumo wrestlers, whose sumo wrestler name is Takanoiwa. Haruma Fuji and Takanoiwa are of completely different sumo stables, sumo schools, but all these Mongolian sumo wrestlers came together in order to enjoy themselves, but Haruma Fuji was not pleased with Takanoiwa's behavior, and he reprimanded him for his bad behavior. But Takanoiwa did not listen to what Haruma Fuji had to say and started playing with his, continued playing with his smartphone, and Haruma Fuji got more and more enraged, and then suddenly he started to beat Takano Fuji with his beer bottle. The exact number of punches that Haruma Fuji delivered to Takanoiwa is not exactly clear, but it must have been quite an amount of violence because Takanoiwa lost consciousness. Afterwards, when Takanoiwa's boss heard about this incident, he thought that it should be reported to the police. And from that point on, things got problematic. Usually, the Sumo Association would have tried not to let anything be heard about this incident in the larger public. But because Takanoiwa's sensei, the famous former sumo wrestler Takano Hana, reported the incident to the police, it became a public affair and drew quite a lot of attention from the public and of course from the media. Interestingly enough, it was not Haruma Fuji who was really criticized for beating up the younger sumo wrestler, but Takano Hana for reporting the incident to the media and the police. Usually these kind of incidents are tried to be kept secret and to be solved within the sphere of the sumo world itself without anyone knowing about it. But Takano Hana had made perhaps a grave mistake for reporting this incident to the police so that it became a public affair. Well, that is not what I really want to stress. I think the case of Haruma Fuji quarreling with a younger wrestler and criticizing his behavior is somewhat symptomatic for the organization and the hierarchical structures in the world of Japanese sports, be it sumo or baseball or other kind of sports. And especially these kind of hierarchical structures where older members take advantage of younger members and have younger members somehow do slave labor for them, serve them in certain regards, can also be found in the many sports circles found either at Japanese universities, but more at high schools and what is between primary schools and high schools? Chugakko, what is it called in Japanese? Junior high schools, yes. And this is something, this kind of hierarchical structure in Japanese sports is something that is of concern to researchers in Japan itself, who take an interest in sports as a science, as a research topic. A lot of Japanese researchers on the history or the sociology of sports think that the way sports in Japan developed since the Meiji period might be responsible for the kind of very feudal or hierarchical organization in Japanese sports in modern times. And the fact that we have incidents similar to the Haruma Fuji incident also in the world of judo and other areas of modern sports is seen as the immediate result of how sports became institutionalized during the Meiji period in conjunction with the introduction of physical education during the Meiji period. This, I think, one should be aware of when dealing with the history of sports and physical education in Japan, because it immediately establishes a link with something that took place more than 150 years ago and what is evolving before our eyes in modern times. Part of my paper I will read, which might be boring for you. Part of the paper I will try to talk freely by looking at my slides. So first I will give you a certain kind of theoretical basis for what I'm thinking about when talking about sports and the introduction of physical education at Meiji period schools. In Europe, the question of the human body as a philosophical problem can be traced back to pre-Socratic times. Of course, it was not the body as a biological organism that was of interest, but rather its relationship to soul and mind. Discussion of the subject in the European Middle Ages and early modern times still followed this tradition, while the body itself was more and more conceived of as a machine which functioned according to universal laws of nature. The intellect of the human subject was measured according to a transcendental notion of reason that did not depend on any physical limitations. Due to his endowment with reason, man, it was thought, could transcend the limitations of the body and shape it with the help of rational rules of behavior in order, on the one hand, to free it from all animalistic needs, except the most essential ones like food, for example, and, on the other hand, in order to align it with the ever-growing demands concerning its performativity. Despite all attempts to overcome the dichotomy of man as a rational subject, somehow thrown into an animalistic body, in the field of philosophical discussions, efforts to determine the purpose of the human body often were mediated by drawing upon the rational side of human endowment, either in the more idealistic variants or the materialistic reductions. It seems that man can always grasp his body or her body only as a vis-a-vis, as the other. He or she is dependent on it for experiences and activities, but in his or her experience of self never attains a sense of identity with the body. Thus, the body remains a means of expression, an instrument by which the human subject represents himself or herself with the help of gestural and mimic symbolism on the stage of social relations. The molding of man takes place via the inner subject that becomes the object of moral and intellectual education. The body, however, is relegated to the role of a vehicle by which the thus formed subject expresses itself as the true human being. In contrast, the more recent studies of the human body do not any longer turn to the body as a means of expression only, but focus on the development of modern European societies from the point of subject shaping that takes the body as its point of departure. The latter is not merely the vehicle of expression any longer, but rather the very canvas or surface to be filled with signatures. Bodily punishments, tattoos, discipline acquired via learning and conforming to etiquette rules, for example, bodybuilding, beauty operations, and so on. Signatures which make a human being predictable and that shape him or her into a social subject. Technologies of the self, as Foucault called them, both in the mental as well as bodily dimension, can of course be found in the context of Chinese and Japanese cultures as well. One only has to think of the role and the extent taken by training in the techniques of proper behavior or etiquette that bring bodily movements as well as mental dispositions under a strict regime of discipline. But what of the techniques of physical exercise that constitute one of the most prominent forms of shaping the self via the body in modern societies? One of the distinct fields among technologies of the self is that of health care, which, at least in our modern understanding, also encompasses that of sports and physical exercise as one of the prominent means to strengthen the physical endowment and contribute to the greater well-being of body and soul. Such a concern with health in Japan did not begin in the Meiji period, but can be followed back far in time. But it was during the Edo period that a widespread concern with health care can be observed both through popular health care manuals and a proliferation of learned treatises. A belief in the individual human being's responsibility for preserving his or her physical integrity and leading one's life to the fullest can be ascertained in dietetic manuals, for example in Takai Ranzan's admonitions regarding food consumption. This already is indicated by the first part of the full title, Preserving One's Allotted Span of Life, and so on. In his personal foreword, Ranzan states this attitude more explicitly. The individual lifespan varies. This is decreed beforehand by heaven and therefore beyond the reach of human interference. However, whether one lives right to the end of one's preordained or natural lifespan, or whether one dies an untimely death far in advance of the rulings of heaven, is solely due to the personal way of life and the care a person takes of his or her physical endowment. This was no original idea, of course, but one of the central principles of traditional Chinese medicine. The key concept in this context, caring for or nourishing or nursing life, in Japanese yojo, already occurs in literary documents prior to the earliest known medical text proper from the 2nd century BCE. But whereas ancient Chinese documents, where one can, for example, find pictures similar to this one, for example, documents containing this kind of poses, even not, if not in this shape, already can be found in the Mawangdui tombs, which were built about 200 before our times. Although these documents knew some kind of physical exercises that were meant to strengthen the flow of the vital energy through the body, where the legendary doctor Hua Duo recommends to engage in manual work and bodily activity. Therefore, in the Ishimpo, an early Japanese manuscript from the 10th century dealing with health care, one reads, "When the body can move about and shake, energy from food will be consumed, blood in the veins will circulate, and no diseases can occur. However, things should not be overdone." The Ishimpo, And such kind of exercises were not a concern found in the dietetic literature of the Edo period as well. One of the few examples to be found is provided by the Confucian scholar Kaibada Ekken in his famous Yojo-kun. Ekiken counsels putting the body to work every day and taking a stroll of a few hundred paces after every meal. However, an excess of physical toil or physical exercise is as harmful as too much idleness and sleep. Did Edo period people then not exercise their bodies except where work made it necessary? One might assume that at least those samurai who dedicated themselves to mastering the sword or other weapons also had to undergo some kind of bodily training for doing so. But not all samurai, probably only a minority, followed the martial arts in earnest. And when a new technology of military training, Takashima Shuhan's school of gunnery, which was based on European models of training in the use of fire weapons, was adopted by the shogunal government in 1841, which also involved physical exercises, it met with widespread rejection among samurai who were supposed to undergo this kind of training. Kitazawa Kazutoshi surmises that the reason for the bad reputation lay in the group tactics and the need to shape one's body to perform in harmony with other group members, whereas in sword fighting and so on, samurai were used to hone their individual skills and their mental disposition. Such a refusal to undergo physical education was not very conducive to the aims of the Bakufu and later the Meiji government to draw equal with European and American nations in terms of military preparedness and efficiency. And this under conditions where the average physical endowment of the Japanese put them at a great disadvantage. If you look at this picture, you can get an impression of the differences in hate between European or American people in the Meiji period and Japanese men at the time. One should not forget that a considerable number of Japanese men at the beginning of the Meiji period did not reach the height of 150 centimeters that was considered necessary for entering the army after universal conscription had been introduced in 1873. Thus, the new Meiji government had to devise a number of techniques to ascertain the physical enhancement of Japanese bodies, being well aware, of course, that small Japanese men could not be turned into European or American giants. One of the areas that came under discussion in this regard at first was nutrition food. In a famous article called Nikshoku no Ron, written for a producer of dairy products in 1817, Fukuzawa Yukichi had argued against the largely vegetarian food culture of the past and strongly recommended one based on meat and milk consumption. Only with this change in the nutritional habits will the Japanese people escape the fate of weak bodies and minds and short life. By eating meat, they will turn into a healthy and creative people and thereby lay the foundations for a modern and strong nation with healthy and strong citizens. And it was again Fukuzawa who drew attention to physical exercises as a part of the school curriculum in Western countries. In the first volume of Seiyo Jijo, he relates how he witnessed pupils at London's King's College spending their break time on the school's playground by engaging in physical activities, engaging in the place of the 5 wild birds, as he calls the Taoistic techniques of bodily movements, moving their arms and legs and thereby dispersing the cramps brought about by long and hard studying and preserving the health of their bodies. This experience might have triggered his later view on physical education to be found in his autobiography. There he says, "In the method for educating children, I place absolute importance on the body and do not force them to read from an early age on. First, to let the animalistic body come into his own and then nurture the human heart. That is my principle. Also, there is the attention to health care when it comes to pregnancies and giving birth to strong and healthy children that was of great interest to early writers in the Meiji period. This was not a new topic, since the concern with ensuring the health of children was already prominent in Edo period advice manuals addressing pregnant women. So it is in continuity with older examples when, for example, the Ningen Oshiegusa, a Nishiki-like presentation of the development of a child until birth, printed in 1880. I have a picture for this. To come together in matrimony is a universal principle and the most important task in the life of man. Two partners conjoin in harmony, rectify their customs and habits, and take care of the strength and weaknesses of their bodies. Thus, those with healthy and strong bodies will engender healthy and strong children. The harmonious community of husband and wife, as well as the affirmation of the pleasures of sex, lie on the same line that Watanabe Hiroshi and Kawamura Kunimitsu had stressed for the Edo period. But a new factor enters when the procreation of valiant, strong sons is stressed as the obligation of men and women in service of the state. Kokka. Kokka, of course, is an ancient word that in this context certainly is used with a new meaning in correspondence to European ideas of the state, as well as the relationship between the state and its citizens. In the Edo period, children had not been born in fulfillment of a mother's duty to the nation-state, even though authorities had begun to take an interest in pregnancies and births since the middle of the 18th century. The idea that children are linked to the fate of the state gathers momentum in the Meiji period. The second number of the youth magazine Nihon no Shonen, which was published in March 1889, in its opening article, for example, asks its juvenile addressees to remember that they are the flowers of the state, Kokka no hana, and the buds from which spring the flowers of the state. Here, one can also find a reference to the subject of physical exercise. When the author of the article encounters the lively and bright boys clad in their gymnastic wear, with their bags over their shoulders and merrily walking through March snow full of energy, it strikes him that they hold it in their hands that the flowers of Japan will open up fully in the future. For no one can doubt that those boys with their healthy red faces, who have no moment to spare except for play and studies, hold the fate of the state in their hands. But since when did these boys run to school only clad in gymnastic wear? That is somewhat difficult to answer. At least the author does not reserve any time for physical exercises in the model plan for how to spend a day effectively, which he provides a few pages later. But at least in the years around 1890, one finds remarks pointing to physical exercises as being an important activity in the life of the younger generations. Note, for example, this short letter to the editor found in the first number of the children's magazine Yonen Zashi, published in January 1891. There it says, "Bodily activity or sports is something necessary for men, and because the spirit grows weary and one inevitably brings forth a disposition of idleness when one studies too much, schools everywhere have constructed sport grounds. That is because they are a construction that disperse a disposition of exhaustion and idleness. Well, words like these could not have been easily found 20 years earlier at the beginning of the Meiji time. How then did physical education enter the Meiji period school system? To answer this question, it is helpful to go back in place and time, back to France. So we have to go back, and I have to go back with my slides. We have to return to the age of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Sorry. And his ideas of physical education. Rousseau perhaps would have been rather surprised to learn that later he was considered to be the father of modern thought on physical education. I don't know if anyone among you has read Émile. No one? In this famous, novel-like work of Rousseau, a plenitude of bodily experiences to be acquired by means of bodily movements, play and physical exercises have an important role in order to support the course of nature, as Rousseau calls it, and help a child to become a true human being. But for Rousseau, the problem with this was that his theory of physical education is not similar to what later theories of physical education made of it. Foucault wanted to enable the unfolding of that which is good in human nature before it is deformed by the detrimental effects of life in human society under the exigencies of human culture. So he was completely contrary to what later theories had in mind when they went back to Émile and tried to read Émile in a way that a theory for physical exercises and educating the body could be read from it as part of a school curriculum. But there were some countries where Rousseau was misunderstood in this way, and this was especially true for the case of Germany, where one can find the origins of the modern way theories for physical education were developed. Especially the movement of the so-called philanthropists and its followers with their reform schools like Pestalozzi's and others turned Rousseau's aims on its head. For example, Johann Christoph Gutsmuth and Friedrich Ludwig Jahn, who in Germany is known as Turnvater Jahn, were especially influential in this respect, and a certain number of their students who went to other parts of Europe and propagated the ideas they had learned from Gutsmuth and from Jahn in England and other European countries, but most especially in the United States, where the ideas that had been developed by German theorists of physical education were implemented in a number of school foundations during the middle of the 19th century. Do you know the word calisthenics? Is there a French word similar to it? It's kind of gymnastics, bodily movements. No? Well, I should probably have written gymnastics. But certain parts of the research literature often uses this word calisthenics, so I used it myself. What can be found in the series of these early people who thought about physical education and who tried to find a way for physical education into school curriculums was movements based on group or formation movements, like one can find in the military, in the army, where group formations are a very important part of the drills, which are used to shape the body of new recruits and make them into obedient and strong soldiers. This kind of formation movements as part of a physical exercise regimen also can be found in the most liberal theorists of physical education or education at large, as for example Pestalozzi. Behind this movement for thinking about bodily movement, physical exercises and ways to shape the body also can be placed into a larger political context. The aim of the national romantic and political democratic movements in the German countries during the first half of the 19th century was to bring about the political freedom in the German countries and to prepare the German people bodily and mentally for the fight against Napoleon and France, of course. So the whole idea of physical education to be established in school curricula somehow can be traced to either discussions among French people during the age of the Enlightenment, like Rousseau on the one hand, and the political movements in the first half of the 19th century in Germany, when the question of how to fight Napoleon and ensure the liberty of the German countries on the one hand, and to bring about democratic governments in these German countries on the other hand, played a very important role. In the German countries, autocratic governments soon tried to oppress these grassroots movements of people thinking about physical education as the method for shaping human bodies and bring about democratic and fully developed human beings. But the Prussian state and other German states saw, of course, the advantages of physical dimension. By introducing physical education into the school system, they had the idea that young children from a very early age on already can be shaped into obedient and healthy and strong subjects, which can be then recruited for the Prussian army and used for political and military purposes, of course. So for us nowadays, physical education in the context of school education does not have any kind of nationalistic or military dimension anymore, I think. But during the second half of the 19th century, this idea that the school can be used not only for educating the minds of young children, but most of all the bodies of young pupils, of children, in order to educate them as obedient and future soldiers, was a very pragmatic and very important new idea. Why this long look at physical education in Germany? What does Germany have to do, or what does France have to do with the introduction of physical education in Japanese schools during the Meiji period? Well, this idea of physical education in Japan during the Meiji times cannot be considered apart from what took place in other parts of the world. And in this context, it is quite interesting that one of the most well-received proponents of world history in recent years, C.A. Bailey, in his book The Birth of the Modern World, very much stresses the idea of uniformity which developed during the 19th century and which exerted influence on other countries around the world, bringing about a growing conformity to standards in bodily practices, starting with clothes and ending with a regimen of bodily discipline. So when we observe that during the Meiji period physical education was introduced to Japanese schools, this development also can be read as one of the examples for how ideas that had been developed in the European or the American context found entrance into other cultures and brought about this image of a growing global society which worked according to very similar principles and which did not show any great differences from country to country. There are different ways to look at the introduction of physical education in the context of Meiji period schools. One of the venues that can be taken to look at the problem is to start with the beginnings. Why did people in Japan during the Meiji period suddenly think to introduce physical education to the newly developing school system when there were no prior examples of physical education as a systematic means to shape human bodies? On the one hand, there is the advice given by the people from America and Europe in Japan who had been employed by the Japanese government and by Japanese institutions, like, for example, D. Murray, an American scholar who served as advisor for the Ministry of Education in Japan for a number of years, who introduced the idea of three educational principles: the mental education, the moral education, and the physical education to Japanese politicians at that time. Once we start with this idea that physical education should be one of the three guiding principles for education, we can then take a look at the stages through which the developing school system in Meiji Japan run. And we can distinguish between these four stages, which are related to the different edicts which were drafted by the Japanese government, which you probably know when you have sit on Christian Galland's lectures and classes on the Meiji period educational system. So I won't go into much detail. You probably know the name of all these edicts and laws. When you look at the regulations found in these documents, you will find that they mention physical education as something that should be taken into consideration. Young children are mentioned here, which should receive education in Taiso. Taiso is a very new word in Meiji period Japan. There are no precursors for this word in Edo period Japanese, so it's a newly coined word in Meiji Japanese language. Very young children at Taiso and Yugi are mentioned in this context. And the type of Taiso is further qualified as a Kadui form, a very moderate form of Taiso, whereas older children then are also to be educated in what is called Tairetsu Undo here, which can be seen as the implementation of what early theorists of physical education in Europe had understood under words such as group formation, movement, drills. And if we run through these educational documents, we will notice that from stage to stage, the weight given to the idea of Taiso or physical education as part of the school curriculum is growing. The stipulations concerning physical education become more detailed, and the hourly parts of the curriculum that per week should be spent on physical education also is growing. So physical education as part of the weekly school curriculum grows in weight, but unfortunately there are limitations. Although the laws of the time make provision for physical education in schools, it is very difficult for the authorities to realize their aims. In order to educate students, pupils in this area of physical education, you of course need teachers. But who is to teach European style Taiso or gymnastics or formation, group formation type kind of drills in Meiji period schools? I think also in other areas of the school curricula it was very difficult to find well-schooled teachers in the early years of the Meiji period. But you could find teachers who could teach students how to read or how to write, because of course there were Confucian scholars or Dangaku scholars or Buddhist priests who already had got their schooling in the Edo period, who also could serve as school teachers for reading and writing or even mathematics in the early years of the Meiji period. But because there were no precedents for physical education in the late Edo period, it was almost impossible to find specialized teachers for physical education in the early Meiji years. So although schools wanted to introduce physical education as part of the curriculum, they did not have the means to do so because they were lacking the teachers to teach physical education. That was one of the reasons the Japanese government employed one of the people on this list. George Adams Leland came to Japan at the end of the 1870s. He was especially employed by the Japanese government in order to introduce physical education to Japan and to educate teachers who could go to the provinces and teach physical education, or who also could teach other teachers who could be employed in the growing sphere of educating new teachers. Leland is known for the introduction of what in Japanese is called Futsu Taiso to Japan. Futsu Taiso is a kind of gymnastics which does not put great stress on the human body. It's a very moderate form of physical exercise. And Leland stressed the idea that it is necessary for promoting health, and it is suitable for the Japanese who are often not very strong constitution. Whereas Leland expressed the idea of Futsu, a very kadui, a very moderate form of Taiso. The person who sacked him, who was responsible for losing Leland his job, Modi Adinodi, had other ideas. Modi Adinodi is known for the introduction of Heishiki Taiso to Japanese schools after he was promoted to the position of Minister of Education during the 1880s. At the time when Leland was employed or came to Japan in 1878, Modi Adinodi was still in Japan, in America, as a kind of ambassador, official ambassador of the Japanese government. And while Modi Adinodi was in Japan, in America, he became familiar with the educational program of the Massachusetts Agricultural College, a college which had been founded with the express idea of establishing physical education as one of the main subjects of the curriculum, and which was famous for following a rather strict military kind of gymnastics in its educational program. I don't know if you know about a similar institution which later was founded in Japan, the Sapporo Agricultural College, which is the predecessor of the modern Sapporo, or what is it called, the Hokkaido Daigaku? Is it Hokkaido Daigaku? Hokkaido Daigaku? Yes, it is. The old imperial Hokkaido Daigaku was founded or was built on the foundations of this Sapporo Agricultural College, which was founded it was founded on the model of this Massachusetts Agricultural College with similar aims, but not completely the same aims. But also the Sapporo Agricultural College had this idea that physical education should be part of the educational program, and that it should serve to educate and to shape strong and healthy human beings, following a curriculum which is very similar to military gymnastics. So while in Japan already the idea of a military kind of gymnastics found entrance through the Sapporo Agricultural College, the idea of this kind of Heishiki Taiso got momentum with Modi Adinodi after he was appointed as Minister of Education in, I think, 1884 or 5. Yes, 1885. Yes. So what until then had followed Leland's ideas of Futsu, or very moderate Taiso, from the times of Modi Adinodi, changed into a more severe, more exacting and tiring form of Taiso, which was much more modeled after military gymnastics. In this context, one important institution has to be mentioned, which was elementary in this sphere of introducing physical education to Meiji period schools, and that is the Taiso Denshusho. That's an institution which was founded at the end of the 1870s, the institution where Mr. Leland, whom I had mentioned earlier, found a position and exerted his influence. The idea behind this Taiso Denshusho was to educate future teachers for physical education. And it existed for a number of years until Modi Adinodi became the Minister of Education, when it was more or less abolished and had to merge with other institutions. So it did not disappear completely, but it was reshaped and reformed and merged with other institutions. In the documents related to the Denshusho, one can find a number of interesting remarks how early Japanese educators thought about this subject of physical education. But I don't know, how much time do you want me to spend on this subject?
Until the strikers arrive.
I think it's very boring to look at all these documents, and for this purpose I will make a jump to the end of this presentation. And come back to Bailey's idea of uniformity and the spread of more or less similar standards around the world during the 19th century. This idea of uniformity is very interesting because it might help to explain why in so different countries such as Germany, France, the United States and Japan, when one can find similar ideas concerning the purpose and the aims of physical education. But there are also important local factors which are necessary to give the right place for these global trends which have been stressed by C.A. Bailey. Even before Modi Adinodi exerted influence, there were very lively discussions among Japanese politicians concerning the role of physical education in a very certain context. One of the most interesting institutions in this respect is the council or the institution known as Genro-in, the Chamber of Elders. This is not a really very official institution of early Meiji period politics, but a kind of unofficial advisory board to the Tenno. The purpose of this Gendo-in was to discuss law drafts made by the Naikaku, the Japanese government, and if necessary, make suggestions how these laws should be redrafted. Members of this Gendo-in were not really elders, old people. Often they were quite young, and often they did not stay members of the Gendo-in but became ministers or played important roles in Japanese politics outside of this unofficial advisory board. Some of the people one can find at certain stages in the Gendo-in are, for example, Sano Tsunetami, the founder of the Japanese Red Cross Society, Fukaba Bisei, who was very important with regard to the introduction of Shintoistic ideas into Meiji area politics, or Kono Togama, who after his term on the Gendo-in served as Lord of Education at the beginning of the 1880s. These people over a number of years discussed the introduction of physical education to the developing school system from the point of view of military preparedness. At that time, people in Japan still held some fears that Japan might be overwhelmed by America or European countries and be turned into a colony. And fears concerning this often, of course, had to do with the self-image of Japanese politicians or intellectuals at the time. People at that time in Japan considered their own country as a very small and weak country. Therefore, they drew on Switzerland as a model which should be emulated by Japan. Often in the discussions of these Gendo-in people, one can find allusions to Switzerland as a weak country and a small country, which also places great emphasis on the idea of military preparedness. Although Switzerland is a very small country, it has a very strong army, and almost every member of at least the male Swiss population knows how to fight and is schooled in fighting and has his own weapons at home. And somehow Japanese politicians, intellectuals found the idea of this small but militarily very well prepared country in the European mountains to be a very alluring model for how they considered their own country. Although Japan at the time was not really a very small country when compared to most European countries. And although its population was much bigger than the population of many European countries at that time, people in Japan still considered their own country to be a small and weak country. How to preserve the independence of such a small and weak country? In order to answer this question, Switzerland appeared as a very pertinent example. And the idea that in Switzerland every male member of the population is physically well educated and trained to be a soldier also was taken as a hint among these members of the Gendo-in, who thought that the Japanese people should be educated in a similar way. Interestingly enough, in this context, members of the discussion also stress that the idea of war and military preparedness is not something liked by the people in Japan. Although there is a necessity to train members of the Japanese population to be good soldiers ready to defend their own country, the participants of these discussions also know that the idea of military conscription is not very popular, and the idea of war is something abhorrent to modern people. These people taking part in these discussions are not militarists. They do not like the idea of war and military preparedness, but they think it necessary to make Japan into a militarily prepared country. But they face a problem, or Japanese politics at that time, around the year 1880, faced a problem. Although a system of conscription had been established, one of the problems this system of conscription has to face is that, on the one hand, many Japanese men do not fulfill the norm of 150 centimeters. The other problem is that people try to elude, not to be conscripted into the army, and the number of people drafted into the army had been declining from year to year. How can this problem be solved? One of the answers that the people in the Gendo-in considered in this respect was the idea of introducing physical education to the schools. It is difficult to draft men into the army. Adult men do not want to enter the army. But what about giving them no choice, because they already have been schooled from their early children years on to be put into the service of the state by introducing physical education and using physical education as one of the first steps for military preparedness? that seemed to be a very valiant answer to some of the people in the Gendo Inn, and they made drafts, plans for introducing physical education at an early age into the school system in order to circumvent this problem of adult men trying to elude the military conscription system. If one begins schooling children in the principles of physical education, educating them as healthy and strong young people on the one hand, and combining physical education with the idea of military group formation drills and military gymnastics, one can prepare children from a very early age onward to be ready for being conscripted into the army and being turned into future obedient soldiers that are ready to defend the independence of Japan. I think that this idea of physical education and military preparedness also can be considered in another context, a context for which I gave the name Inoue Tetsujido as an example. The discussions concerning the weakness of Japan and the difficulty of ensuring the independence of Japan did not only take place with regard to the question of conscription system and military preparedness among politicians on the one hand, but it also can be found among intellectuals and other politicians who took part in the discussions concerning the term Sakyo. What is meant by Sakyo is that is the question whether one should allow foreigners to live in Japan wherever they want, or whether one should restrict them to live in only certain places like Yokohama, for example. Why does one have to discuss this question? One of the background ideas is that if one allows foreigners to live everywhere in Japan, wherever they want to, that could have bad influence on the economic development of Japan. Foreigners cannot be trusted, but they can be trusted in so far as they will pull the wealth out of Japan and send it abroad, and thus make Japan into an economically weak country. They will destroy the economic foundations of Meiji period Japan, which when compared, for example, to England or the United States, had a very weak economical foundation. On the other hand, there are the ideas for which Inoue Tetsujido, who is a philosopher, can be thought as a good example. Inoue Tetsujido drew attention to the fate of certain people living in the Pacific Isles. He talked much about the Maori people in New Zealand and the population of other much smaller islands with the Polynesian or Melanesian population, who, in his words, almost face extinction through the contact with European people. When the Europeans came to New Zealand, they brought unknown diseases together with them, which caused the death of a large part of the Maori population. Other much smaller islands in the Pacific had almost been extinguished by this contact with the Europeans, and Inoue Tetsujido was afraid that something similar could be experienced in Japan if one allowed foreigners to live wherever they wanted in Japan. What one can find in Inoue Tetsujido's argumentation is this same kind of idea that Japan is a very weak country with a very weak population, which also can be found in the rather militarily oriented discussion among the members of the Genro-in. So from very different perspectives, people in Japan considered their own country and its population to be weak and endangered by the contact with European countries and America. So the idea that physical education could be used as something useful for turning the weak Japanese population into a strong and healthy population can be regarded as very attractive from various different discourses or discussions found in early or middle Meiji period Japan. So I have talked a lot about the theoretical foundations for introducing physical education and the political aims that might be related to the idea of physical education. But what about the children's education? Do we know something about them? We do not know very much about children. As with other parts of the history of children, children always seem to be lacking from the picture. It's very difficult to grasp them, to find them anywhere. They do not tell very much about themselves. They do not leave many traces of their existence. We do not know what Meiji period children thought about the beginnings of physical education in early or middle Meiji period society. We even do not have many pictures showing Japanese pupils doing physical exercises. Of course, we have a large number of manuals for physical exercises from the Meiji period. Like, for example, this or this. But these pictures, although they are supposed to show children, do not look very much like representation of children, right? The people we see here are just chiffres used for depicting the kind of group formations favored by school and physical education theorists at the time, but not really people. And this is true for all manuals that can be found in Meiji period books. We have pictures like these that show very small children, but they are not related to the topic of physical education in schools. In any case, this kind of kakube jishi kind of extortion of small children was vanishing from Japan. It had been prohibited by the Japanese government. Young children were not to be subjected to this kind of acrobatic and the hard and very severe physical education it is grounded on anymore. This leaves a very small number of depiction of Japanese children doing some kind of sports to be encountered in schools like this. But these two are not really existing children, but just children as they are imagined by adults who have produced these kind of pictures. There were so many children in Japan, but they did not leave many traces. And this, for a study project focusing on the history of childhood and on the history of children itself, is a very high hurdle that almost cannot be overcome, I think. And it has to be a point of discussion for the future of any study project focusing on the history of childhood, I think. Christian Gallon and others in the field of the history of childhood have been discussing this problem for a long time now, and I think we still have not arrived at an easy answer how to get nearer to the existence of children themselves. We always see them from the point of adults who either talk about them in educational treatises or who turn them into the subject of their own aspirations, like the politicians who were responsible for the introduction of physical education to schools. These politicians were aware that one could not subject children to any kind of regimen. Sometimes they talk about things considered to be very modern. They talk about the idea that physical exercises have to be appropriate to the respective age of the children in school. Children in the earliest years of primary school cannot be subjected to the same kind of strict physical exercise regimen as children on higher levels of the school education system. So there have to be measures taken to ensure that the education always is appropriate to the age of the children. It has to be, what is the exact English word for it? Well, it has to be appropriate to the children themselves. But what does that mean? What is appropriate to a child at a certain age? We do not find any discussions concerning this further growing idea. So many questions are left. How to come to grips with this problem of childlike and appropriate education for children in general, and more especially so for the case of physical education. This is more or less all I would like to say at the moment. Thank you very much.